Washington Journal continues.
Senator, why do you oppose the United States going to war in Iraq?
Well, first of all, everybody knows Saddam Hussein is an SOB. I think we ought to make that clear. I haven't found one American who defends him or his works, although I hasten to add that during the Iraqi-Iran war, we backed Iraq for almost 10 years. Why? Because we thought the Ayatollah of Iran was an even greater threat, an even greater SOB than Saddam Hussein. But the question in my mind, what's the hurry? Why do we have to jump into Iraq? Some people say it's going to happen before the end of February. We've got a large team of UN monitors over there who say they need more time to really determine the extent of Saddam Hussein's violations. Even if there are violations, which there probably are, it may or may not be any threat to us. I'm not at all enthusiastic about dropping an American army of young men into that Middle East tinderbox.
What would you like to see the inspectors bring out that would justify our going to war over there?
I'd like to see a clear threat to the United States established before we go to war. You know, many years ago, after Winston Churchill tried to talk our leaders into not going into Vietnam, he said, following his rejection by Washington, there's only one thing certain about a war, and that is nothing is certain about a war. And I think that's true. I've lived long enough to remember Korea. I was a young college instructor at the time. That was June of 1950. And President Truman, I think, honestly said he thought it would be a very brief police action. Didn't even bother with a declaration of war. But the implication was we'd go in there and in a few days push the North Koreans out of South Koreans. 53 years later, this morning, we still have 40,000 American troops tied down in the ice and snow along that 38th parallel. When we went into Vietnam, President de Gaulle of France did his best to talk our leadership from going in there. We told him we had information that made it important that we intervene. And for almost 30 years, we were floundering around in Vietnam, almost 60,000 young American lives lost. I can't walk by that Vietnam memorial, that long black marble wall here in Washington, without weeping, seeing those 58,000 plus silent American names, teenagers, many of them, who died. I don't want that to happen in Iraq. I suppose one would have to assume that the mightiest military country in the entire history of the world could crush Iraq pretty quickly. But we don't know that. We don't know what the consequences of that will be. So I say, what's the hurry? Let's give it a little more time. I guess I stand with General Schwarzkopf, the hero of the last Gulf War with Saddam Hussein, who has said in the last few days that he sees no evidence that would justify an American attack on Iraq.
We'd like for you to join in the conversation with former Senator George McGovern, and you can give us a call at 202-585-3880 if you agree with President Bush, 202-585-3881 if you disagree with President Bush. And our first call comes from Centerville, Virginia, on the disagree line. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, I would like to thank the Senator. It is so refreshing to see such sincerity and heart. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I am so concerned with the arrogance of this administration. I find it embarrassing. America has always held the moral high ground. We have always been looked to as the peacekeepers. My father was a World War II veteran, and I am so concerned with the arrogance. I mean, Richard Pearl says France is no longer an ally. do we forget France helped us with the Revolutionary War? I am so concerned, and I think people need to make their voices heard. I feel like Alice in Wonderland. I fell down the hole, and this is a whole new world.
Well, of course, I agree with that. I don't understand this rush to war. I really can't get my mind around it. War is something you go into only very carefully, unless you're attacked. Then you have to respond. But has anyone come up with one shred of evidence that Iraq has done anything against the United States? They went into Kuwait, we know that, some 12 years ago, and we rallied the whole world behind us, including the Arab world. We went in there and pushed them out. But in the last 12 years, I don't know anything that Saddam Hussein, as big a rascal as he is, we all agree on that, has done a thing against the United States. And the poor Iraqi people who've had to put up with this guy, eventually they'll get rid of him, I think. But I just can't support putting our boys on the line in Iraq. I want to say one thing about that. We wouldn't even be fooling around with Iraq if it hadn't been for 9/11, the loss of 3,000 Americans in that tragic attack on the World Trade Center. There isn't a shred of evidence that I've been able to find that Iraq or Saddam Hussein had one iota of involvement in that attack. And the president, very quickly after the attack, announced, "I want Osama bin Laden dead or alive." Why? Because we knew that Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda engineered that attack. But the CIA very promptly said at the time that Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis were not involved. When we couldn't find Saddam Hussein either dead or alive, then we had to have a scapegoat, apparently, and so we discovered Saddam Hussein again, and now the rush to war.
East Haven, Connecticut, on the Agree line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm very glad George McGovern even gave me an introduction about Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis and 911, because as a matter of fact, okay, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis had nothing to do with 911. The Pope went into a mosque in Syria just before 911, and those kids that drove those Muslims couldn't do that. Muslims are not allowed to target buildings. They have only one building, and that is Mecca. People had to be very sick to do that. If a Muslim was going to crash a plane into a building, he'd have to put on a blindfold and believe that Allah is driving the plane. That is number one. Number two, I agree with President Bush's language, because as long as a Pope with a night wall time who walks into a mosque in Syria without giving a damn about anybody's common sense is a blasphemer, Rama, I want Saddam Hussein and my president to talk a war up without going to war, because I will not listen to a Pope talk peace with a night wall time who walks into mosques as if everything is meaningless.
You know, one of the problems with going to war now with an Arab country, Iraq, is that it's going to increase the terrorist attacks on the United States. Obviously, I don't have positive proof of that. Neither does President Bush have positive proof that we're safe going into Iraq. But what we know is that for some reason, or maybe several reasons, there are thousands of angry young men across the Arab world who detest the United States. I wish we had more of our bright, intelligent experts focusing on that problem. Why? We all think this is the greatest country in the world. I've believed that ever since I was a small child. I still do. At my advanced age today, I think America is the greatest country on the planet. But I also know, sadly, that large numbers of people in the developing world, especially in the Arab world, detest us. And I wish we'd spend more time trying to figure out why. How is it that a wealthy zealot like Osama bin Laden can walk through the slums of Cairo and the backcountry of Saudi Arabia, the hills of Afghanistan, and recruit thousands of young men who are willing, if necessary, to throw away their lives in attacking us? And it would be interesting to know more about what goes on in the heads of these young potential terrorists.
Tell us a little bit about your experience in World War II and how that has shaped your philosophy about war.
Well, I'm very proud of my involvement in World War II. I haven't talked about it a lot until this book came out by Professor Ambrose on the pilots who flew the B-24 bombers in World War II, which is what I did. But I also saw what war can do. We had to fight that war against the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Tojo in Japan, or they would have taken over much of the world. So I don't regret that, but I also remember what war is like. I still have the image in my mind of heavily loaded bombers filled with high-octane gasoline, bombs and men and weapons and equipment trying to take off, crashing on takeoff, everybody blowing to bits. I remember bombers flying through the air off my wing, being hit by anti-aircraft fire, catching fire, exploding, falling to the earth, no parachutes. But when I listen to the war cries of some of the top people in this administration, beginning with the president, I know that I'm listening to people that never been near a battlefield, and that worries me. I don't see very many soldiers clamoring to get into Iraq. I spend most of my time in South Dakota, my home state, and Montana. I have not found one single person in either of those states who favors jumping into a war now with Iraq.
Next is Pueblo, Colorado on the Disagree line. Good morning.
Good morning. Senator, when you got to talking about World War II, I tell you, I could talk to you a long time about that. I was in World War II.
Good for you.
In Europe, went an invasion of southern France. And, you know, I felt proud of that, you know.
I did too.
But then and now, it's just like difference in white and black.
Yeah.
It's no comparison whatsoever. Now, I would like to talk about World War II. I could talk from now on, but I can't understand how we got here where we are, even from the World Bank of England going down, Iraqi-Iran war, the Iran-Contra thing, whole ball of wax. There's a few people in that thing, Senator. If they get them in the screen and start shaking them around, look here, we'll know they're in this outfit today.
Yeah.
And this thing, and it's a shame. Why did he grab all the troops and leave and go to Afghanistan, left the doors wide open here right after, wouldn't let nobody inspect this thing here? I can't understand that.
Yeah, well, I find it hard to understand, and I know the American people do. The latest poll that I've seen was put out by the Pew Research and Polling Foundation, a very respected organization. It shows that 53% of the American people are opposed to putting an American army into Iraq, to invading that country. The president calls that by some new doctrine that he calls preemptive war, which means that you hit the other side even though they haven't done anything to hurt us. We used to call that invasion. We used to call that aggression. And I think that's why most of the world, practically the entire world, 3 or 4 exceptions, is against this war, and why a majority of the American people are against it. And let me add this, that when the body bags start coming home from Iraq with young American lives lost, there's going to be an even larger percentage of Americans who think this was a bad idea to get into that war.
In about 25 minutes, we'll be joined by William Crystal with a different view about the pending war in Iraq. Right now, we're taking a call from New York City. Good morning.
Oh, yes. C-SPAN is a great show. I went to school with George W. at the Harvard Business School, but there's one economic impact I'd like to bring up. Is the tax cut is $80 billion a year. Now, $35 oil is costing this country $350 billion a year. And to put that in context, that's all the profits of the Fortune 500 companies. So you're talking about projecting out that you're talking about a stock market going down 50% and home values going down another 50%, because this is a tax. So the situation is taking the strategic reserve and putting that oil out and encouraging OPEC to break its price-fixing cartel by putting oil out in the open market.
And what does this have to do with the war?
Well, the impact of the war is the following: is that you're talking about costing the airlines. The airlines cannot survive with $35 oil. They can't survive. Their number one cost to operate is oil. So war represents, an economic catastrophe. You'll have the stock market at 4,000. Home values will be down 50%. Inflation will be up 8%. So you've got $35 oil. I mean, our history is $35 oil is an economic...
Sorry.
I think the caller was trying to make the point that you get into a war, it's going to be inflationary, it's going to drive up the budget deficit, it's going to increase the national debt. We were well on the way 2 years ago to reducing the national debt, which we were doing. We had a surplus in the budget that has since turned to another big red ink problem for us. Any kind of a war is inflationary unless you have wage and price controls, which I can't see this administration doing, although President Nixon did it during the Vietnam War. But war is not good news for the American economy. Some people think that back in their minds our strategists are trying to get control of that Iraqi oil. I have no evidence that that drives American policy, but I do know that war is almost invariably inflation. I do know that our national debt, our taxes, and our federal budget are all going to go out of balance if we go to war with Iraq.
Huntington, New York, good morning on the Disagree Line.
Good morning, and good morning to Senator McGovern. Watched you through the years, and you are a wonderful asset to our country. Also through the years, I've watched this conservative ethic take this country and put its head deep in the sand and isolate it from the rest of the world. And the news media get bought up by the big people in this country and put out only what they want. If you compare the news of the United States to the rest of the world, we find out that we are the ones who have isolated ourselves. Would you please comment on how that happened and how these chicken hawks got into government?
Well, that's a good question, because there's no question that this proposal to invade Iraq has left us almost alone in international opinion. Old allies like France are dead set against it. So are the Germans, so are the Russians, so are the Chinese, so are the Indians. Almost every country that we've traditionally thought of, with the one exception of Tony Blair in England, has come out against us going into Iraq. Prime Minister Blair is a brilliant man, But we need to recognize that he's having the battle of his life just trying to hold his own political party behind him now, because he came out in favor of the Bush policy on Iraq. There's an interesting thing that I'd like to call your attention to. When General Powell, whom I've always admired as a thoughtful, moderate man, when he was trying to make the case against Saddam Hussein at the United Nations here a few days ago, he singled out British intelligence for their analysis of the Iraqi situation. He quoted them at some length and urged his listeners to read the report that the Brits put out on Iraq. Now it turns out a few days later that part of the speech, that part of the British report, they had taken out of some articles published in the press and in magazines, some of it several years ago. So it wasn't British intelligence, it was a magazine writer that our Secretary of State was quoting. We understand, as near as I can figure out, about half the CIA disagrees with the Bush policy. About half are going along with it, but they seem to be very strongly divided. And with 53% of the American people saying no on a war with Iraq, why would this administration want to take us into war and further isolate us from global opinion? The questioner said, why did we get into this position? You know, I think it's partly because this administration feels the enormous military power that they control. The old saying is that all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's some of that going on. We think we can have our way anywhere in the world. We thought that when we went into Vietnam, and we find it's not that easy.
Earlier you mentioned North Korea, and in the front page of the Washington Post this morning, headlines, North Korea standoff sent to the UN Council. What's your opinion on the way we're handling things with North Korea in that part of the world?
Much better than with Iraq, in the sense that we're trying to use diplomacy. We're trying to get other countries involved. We've asked the Chinese, the Japanese, the South Koreans, help us out on this one. The North, Saddam Hussein stoutly insists that he has no nuclear weapons. I think that's the view of the inspectors who are in there. North Korea says, yeah, we've got them. And anybody that moves against us is going to know that. But so if we're looking hard to try to find some country to go to war with, on the surface it would seem like North Korea would be a better candidate than Iraq. But I don't favor war with either one of them. I think we're taking the right course with North Korea, which is referring it to the Security Council of the United Nations.
Sulphur, Louisiana. Good morning.
Well, good morning, Mr. McGovern.
Yes.
How you doing?
Doing fine.
Me too, just getting fat and sassy.
That's it.
There you go. Hey, listen, I was listening to some of the comments you were making. I like the way you're able to get back into history and get everything organized in one straight line. The Vietnam and the Korean War wouldn't have been not much more effort than any other particular conflict, except it had China and Russia backing them, and once we got up near the top, we were a little cautious, just the way we are kind of mincing around with Korea, because we didn't really want to go to another world war. If they'd have been isolated on an island or more like the situation is now, wouldn't have had too much trouble. You know, we'll lose some people, maybe thousands, but it wouldn't have been much of a problem to win victory. America's never had a problem against attacking small countries that weren't backed, or even backing governments that were totally wrong and that would back us, and we'll swap them out here or there. Mm-hmm. You're wondering how the Arab people seem to be against us. Well, anybody that would, I thank God I live in America and don't live somewhere else. I wouldn't want America bothering with me too much. Right. That's the best point, is that if you live here, it's like the Vikings went out and raided, and they'd come home and say, look what Daddy brought you home from work. Well, all countries do that. It's just some have the ability to do it a little bit better. And how do you do it and still make people think you're a good neighbor? Well, you either, in the Arab conflict we had when the Gulf War first began, we say we had a coalition. We bought half of them and begged some of them not even to join. How can you beg Israel not to help and then beg Turkey with missiles or forgiving debt and all these other countries? We beg or buy off half our friends, and the other half we intimidate. And which I actually love America. I'm just a little disappointed with sometimes the way we run other people's business.
That's exactly my position. I love America, but I want to call it to a higher standard than stumbling into a war with Iraq. You know, even if we say we're going to be careful not to kill civilians when we go in, you can't use the heaviest bombers in the world against a country like Iraq without killing a lot of civilians, men, women, and children. But even if we just kill those young Iraqi soldiers, they have nothing to do with Saddam Hussein's policy. Iraq is not a democracy. It's a brutal dictatorship. It's estimated we killed about 200,000 of the Iraqi army and civilians in the Gulf War. You'll recall that when President Bush Sr. Took us into that war, and I might say with the support of Congress, very narrow support, but he at least had a one-vote margin. He said, "We have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. Our quarrel is with one man, Saddam Hussein. So we killed 200,000 Iraqis with whom we have no quarrel, and Saddam Hussein sails on." So
should we have gone after Saddam Hussein?
I don't think so. I think President Bush properly read the nature of that coalition he'd put together. As the caller has said, we put that together in a kind of a paced-up job. I think the whole Arab world would have deserted us if we had invaded Iraq at that time. Our only purpose was to get that Iraqi force out of Kuwait. Now, there's an interesting historic fact about that, too, that I suppose most of us have forgotten. When Saddam Hussein was stewing around with Kuwait about a border dispute before he went in there, he consulted the American ambassador to Iraq. And she told him, I'm sure, with the approval of Washington, that we were not going to get involved in a border dispute between one Arab nation and another. That's for the Arabs to decide. What do you think Saddam concluded? Do you think he thought, well, the Americans are going to clobber me if I go into Kuwait? I don't think so. I think he got a green light from Washington. But war, as Churchill says, the only thing certain about it is that nothing is certain about war. We do not know. I don't know. President Bush doesn't know. The CIA doesn't know. General Powell doesn't know what's going to happen if we drop an American army into that Middle East tinderbox.
Columbus, Ohio. Good morning. You're next.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Govern, and good morning. My whole purpose of this is to say that you are exactly right. You are so right. I sit back and I listen and I watch. You know, there is too many of our young guys and our young females and our young soldiers that are going to a country to fight a war for what? We're not about, this is not about Saddam Hussein. This is about bin Laden. If you want bin Laden, go get him. Stay out of Iraq. Yeah. We have no business there.
You know, that's one of the problems with launching a war now against Iraq. I've noticed the last few months, once President Bush decided that we weren't going to be able to find Saddam Hussein, and he turned his attention to this bad idea of going to war against Iraq, it seems like that's sort of taken center stage against the war against terrorism. Terrorism is what caused the attack on the World Trade Center. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, this little network of angry young men out there in the desert, they flew those planes. They engineered that attack. Now, Governor Ridge, a good man who is the head of Homeland Security, has warned that if we go to war against Iraq, that doesn't mean he's saying I'm against President Bush, but since Bush appointed him to that job, if we go to war against Iraq, we should expect more, not less, terrorist attacks, because we're going to infuriate young men all across the Arab world if we go in there with our super weapons, our bombers, our automatic weapons, and all the rest. That's not going to make us popular anywhere.
La Quinta, California, your question or comment for Senator McGovern?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for your time this morning, and I have a couple comments. Mr. McGovern, you referenced General Schwarzkopf being not convinced about us going into Iraq. Well, on the recent weekend talk shows, he came out and said that after Colin Powell, Secretary of State's address to the UN, he had changed his mind.
Yes.
And that he was now convinced that there was a link.
Yes, I saw that.
And
but he said the day before General Powell spoke that he hadn't seen any evidence. It seems strange to me that General Powell wouldn't have been consulting with General Schwarzkopf and others all along. I just assumed that that was taking place, but it obviously wasn't. And once General Powell made his statement, you're quite right that Schwarzkopf said that he now had a different view. That doesn't mean he thinks war with Iraq is a good idea. I doubt very much if in his heart of hearts General Schwarzkopf has flipped overnight on the basis of one speech by General Powell. As I said earlier on this program, I admire General Powell. I just happen to think that he's trying to be the good soldier. He's trained to obey the commander-in-chief, which is the President of the United States, but all along he's been trying to get this dispute referred to the United Nations, to get the UN inspectors in there, to let them do their work. And I think that's the proper course rather than going to war. It's if I were the leader of this country, I'd be very, very worried about taking this great nation into a war where half or more of the American people are against it. Why do we want to go to war under those conditions? In World War II, which, as I've said before, I think we had no choice except to go into that war if we wanted to save our civilization. So far as I could tell, 100% of the American people were for our policy in World War II. I couldn't wait to get to the recruiting office and sign up for pilot training. That was the view with all of my friends, and that remained the view throughout the war. We don't have that today. We've got a very, very divided and anguished country before the war ever starts about the idea of going into Iraq.
In December, you wrote an article for Harper's Magazine called "The Case for Liberalism, a Defense of the Future Against the Past." What was that about?
Well, I'm tired of liberals running for governor and not standing up for the liberal ideology. Liberalism has been the heart of the Democratic Party ever since Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, even Abraham Lincoln, the founder of the Republican Party, was a liberal by any stretch of that word. And the point I was trying to make in that article is that instead of being apologetic, saying that liberalism needs to be on the defensive, I would like the American people to remember that every piece of legislation, every government program now generally supported by both political parties began as a liberal initiative over conservative opposition. Social Security, Medicare, rural electrification, civil rights, the environmental programs, collective bargaining for working people, all of those things. I could name 100 of them. I can't think of one positive federal program now on the statute books that both parties endorse, which was opposed by conservatives at the beginning over conservative advocacy. So I want liberals to stand up and say, yes, I'm a liberal like Thomas Jefferson, like Andrew Jackson, like Woodrow Wilson, like Franklin Roosevelt, and all the rest.
Next is Centerville, Virginia, on the disagree line. Good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. And Senator McGovern, I tell you why we utilize diplomacy with the Korea but war against Iraq. You know, Korea didn't attempt assassination of George Bush Sr., but
Korea did not do what?
Didn't attempt the assassination against George Bush Sr., but Saddam Hussein did in '91, as we all know.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I think, is just a personal revenge in part of President Bush. He had this agenda from the beginning, even before September 11, you know, to take this revenge. Doesn't matter, you know, how many thousands of Americans die or how many billions of dollars we spend on this war, you know. This is personal revenge. And I tell you, I'm originally from Iran, and I saw my family almost got killed, the action of Saddam Hussein against Iran, 8 years war. Mm-hmm. But Saddam Hussein is, no questions, as you said, is the biggest SOB, but he's expansionist. He's only terrorist against his own people and his fellow Muslims. Mm-hmm. And if we go to this war, American people better be ready, you know, with this Muslim fanatics. You know, I've seen some of them. Nothing can go through their mind. You know, you cannot talk logic with them. It just they just brainwashed, and we're going to create an Israel situation in the United States, which is all our people going to be in danger. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that's right. That this intervention that's being proposed is not going to make life safer for the American people. Governor Ridge is right. We probably can expect more terrorist attacks. You know, the Israelis have had to go through this. General Sharon, I think, thought by sending Israeli tanks into Palestine that would intimidate them into peace. It hasn't worked that way. These young religious people tie a bomb to themselves, walk across the border, and blow up an Israeli bus. Almost every few days we get another report of that. I think we'll see the same kind of thing directed against the United States if we move into this ill-advised war with Iraq. By the way, we have Iraq pretty well contained. The whole world was alerted to what he was capable of doing during the Gulf War 12 years ago. We've had our airplanes flying over his country north and south ever since. We have forces in Europe that we've had ever since the end of World War II, the NATO forces. We have aircraft carriers in the area. It's not as though we're ignoring him. And he hasn't stepped 1 foot out of Iraq for 12 years since he got that clobbering in the Gulf War. And we have these UN inspectors in there now trying to comb that country. They probably need another 6 months, maybe a year, to complete their work. But what is the big hurry about jumping in there and starting a war now? That's what I'd like to know. I don't have angry, bad feelings towards President Bush. I suppose he's doing what he thinks is right. I have always been a friend of his father, President Bush Sr. So I'm not looking for a quarrel simply because I'm a Democrat or because I'm standing against this war because I'm a patriot who loves this country, and I don't want to see us be needlessly hurt again and more American young men to join these 58,000 whose names are out here on that wall in Washington.
Washington, D.C., you're the last caller with a brief comment or question for Senator McGovern. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I'd like to thank Mr. McGovern's service to this country in the past, and I strongly disagree with your view on this issue, Mr. McGovern. Unfortunately, I believe that Mr. Bush is taking the right course here as a preventive issue here. If people blamed him a lot for not doing anything prior to September 11th, and I can guarantee you he was in a catch-22, because had he rounded up 1,000 suspected Muslim militants in this country prior to 9/11, he would have been labeled a racist and so on through the liberal media.
I think you're right about that. I agree with you. I don't think he's right that 9/11, the tragic loss of 3,000 Americans, should be blamed on Saddam Hussein. Does anyone really think that we would be talking about going to war against Iraq if it were not for the tragedy of September 11th? It was the trauma of that terrible event that has prompted this turn of events that now has us on the edge of a war with Iraq, even though at least half the CIA says he had nothing to do with it, and that Al-Qaeda is the group we ought to be going after, not this miserable ruler of Iraq. President Carter said recently that he doesn't see where Saddam Hussein presents a threat to the United States because of the enormous power that we have. Where we would be hurt and might engage these weapons of Saddam Hussein is if we send young Americans into his country. If he has these weapons of biology and chemistry that we're hearing about, that's when they'll be used, not during peacetime.
Senator George McGovern, thank you for being on the program.
My pleasure.
When we come back, we'll continue the conversation about the pending war in Iraq and other topics with William Crystal, the editor of the Weekly Standard and the author of the book, The War Over Iraq. We'll be right back.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Richard Myers are on Capitol Hill today at a meeting of the Senate Armed Services Committee. They'll be talking about national security issues and the Defense Department's fiscal year 2004.